This show is proudly supported by Habitats at Home, Australia's leading PVC reptile enclosure specialist. Check them out on Instagram and Facebook at Habitats at Home, and be sure to visit habitatsathome.com.au if you're in the market for a new PVC reptile enclosure or other reptile accessories. Massive thanks to Tyson over at Habitats at Home. We'd like to thank our podcast sponsor, Bay, reimagining reptile keeping through innovation. They combine quality, design, and function to create high-end 3D printed reptile products. And if you've got a unique setup or problem, they'll craft a custom solution made just for you. Check them out on Instagram at Bay. This show is proudly supported by Dan from Red Earth Reptiles. If you want to drool over some of the best looking green tree pythons in the country, check out Dan on Instagram at red_earth_reptiles. G'day and welcome to Under the Heat Lamp with Joe Mack. Today's guest is Jake Meney. I should have asked you before we started recording on the pronunciation of your last name.
That's all right. I get either or all the time. I say Meney, but it really does not bother me.
Well, today's guest is Jake Meney. How are you? How are you, Jake?
Yeah, I'm great, mate. Thanks for having me here.
No, absolutely. It's my pleasure. I guess we'll just start it how I always do. If anyone's not aware of who you are, could you just give us a bit of a rundown on your history with reptiles?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it goes back a while. I think I must have been 4 or 5 when I first started getting an interest in reptiles, and it very quickly turned into, what could only be described as an obsession, which I think is the case for a lot of us. And that continued right throughout my childhood through into high school and beyond. And never just really lost it. I got my first pet lizard when I was 7 and kept a little bit throughout the years. And then after school, I didn't really know which path I wanted to take, whether I wanted to go and do something completely different or maybe do some ecology work or get into the zookeeping field. And I guess I was kind of presented with this opportunity to start volunteering at the Australian Reptile Park. I knew a few people there that were working, and yeah, they'd been asking me to come up and do a day or two a week with them. And so I started doing that, and I did that for about 10 months, and then a job came up, and thankfully I was offered the job as a young, fresh-faced 19-year-old, and yeah, came straight on as a junior reptile keeper. And I was at ARP for almost 8 years in the end, and actually worked my way all the way up to being the head keeper of what was a very diverse, large herp collection. And then about 2.5 years ago, I guess my career was kind of taking a bit of a different turn. I was becoming a lot more interested in exhibits and exhibit design, and of course was still very, very interested in the herp keeping side of things, but I had kind of felt like I'd done the bulk of what I wanted to do in that space at the time. And an opportunity came up down at Symbio Wildlife Park, which for anyone that doesn't know is just south of Sydney in a town called Helensburgh. And I've always loved Symbio. It's a beautiful place, great crew, doing some really incredible things, not only within the park, but also for conservation. And so there was a lot of opportunity there for me to take that step and move on to a different facility, which was a little bit nerve-wracking at first, but yeah, I've been there for 2.5 years now, and I love the place. So that's where I'm based currently. And I guess adjacent to that, the whole way along, I've been an obsessive herper for a lot of years. Probably started herping when I was 14 or 15 pretty seriously, and that still continues to this day. So yeah, reptiles quite literally have filled my life from the get-go, and hopefully that continues for many years to come.
It sounds like it will, mate. And I think it's a bit of an age-old story. Like there's plenty of really high-quality keepers that have followed that, well, I guess trajectory like yours. You start off as a volunteer at the Australian Reptile Park, and then you end up, God knows where, doing God knows what. It's a pretty common story, I think.
Oh yeah, there's honestly countless people within the industry today that at some point or another have passed through the doors of ARP, and it's great for that. Like, it's so hands-on. not only from a visitor perspective, but also when you're there as a volunteer or a casual or a full timer. You get to do so many things, and it's a smaller place, it's a smaller crew, so you learn the ropes very quickly. And I think a lot of people go on from smaller parks like that as a really good keeper because they've quite literally had to do it all.
Do it all. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say you've moved down to Symbio, where I guess what am I trying to say here? I'm really struggling. I was trying to feed green pythons earlier, like I mentioned to you, and it's clearly just fried my brain a little bit. But after I guess keeping captive animals for a certain amount of time, working in one facility and doing all that they have to offer, you do want to move on to something that maybe not necessarily only piques your interest, but might be a little bit more fulfilling. And I think that at least in my eyes, I guess kind of what I would see as being pretty fulfilling is that the conservation work that's happening, specifically down at Symbio. There's some pretty amazing sort of things going on down there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for those that may not be familiar with what Symbio's got going on, we've got pretty robust facilities for green and golden bell frogs. They've been involved with those for quite a number of years, probably almost going on a decade now. And then in more recent years, we've become involved with the stuttering frog, so Mixophis australis, and then also the Bellinger River turtle, which a lot of people would be familiar with from Taronga. That was where the initial population that was rescued from the river after that disease event, that ended up at Taronga. But then subsequent to that, an additional collection of founders was done on the river, and those turtles came to Symbio to be, I guess, a separate isolated population in case anything were to happen at Taronga. And thankfully, to this day, both populations are going very, very well. Symbio initially got some much younger animals, so it's taken quite a number of years to raise those females to sexual maturity. But thankfully, in the last couple of years, those females have hit a size where they are starting to produce eggs themselves. And we've had eggs and hatchlings the last 3 seasons now. So everything is heading in the right direction at the moment with all of the conservation programs at Symbio, which is a really exciting thing for us as a whole.
Yeah, for sure. It's exciting for you guys and exciting for conservation too. What's the plan with the baby Bellinger River turtles? Are they going to be sort of head started and released, or is there any plan for that?
Yeah, that's the eventual goal. So Taronga have already done a couple of pretty heavily monitored releases with their offspring that they've produced. Because we've still got quite a small number of hatchlings and yearlings and 2-year-olds, we will basically retain those on site for now. And then if the time comes where additional turtles are required for release events, that's where those will kind of come into play. But yeah, for now, the plan is just over the next few years to continue to build our population at Symbio. It's a pretty strict biosecure facility, so everything that comes in is basically monitored to a very high degree, and same with anything that goes out. So there's a lot of processes and protocols and paperwork involved in anything of that scale. And it's exactly the same at Taronga. So it's not an easy process, and you're also dealing with government. So everything can take time, but thankfully, we've got these 2 populations as that, I guess, life raft for the species, because they were quite literally gone. If they did not come into captivity, they would likely, very, very likely be extinct in the wild, that species.
Yeah, that's very, very cool work. I feel like with a lot of these the captive conservation programs, the easiest part is keeping and breeding the animals. On top of that is all of the paperwork and procedures and protocols and whatnot that come into place, usually from other governmental departments and what would have you. That's the real challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. But thankfully, we've got some really great partners in all the programs that we're involved with that try and streamline it as much as they possibly can. And hopefully they will continue into the future. And Who knows? Hopefully, touch wood, in another 15, 20 years, we will see, large numbers of these species back where they are meant to be.
Yeah, that's the dream, hey? That's the dream.
That's it.
Um, how do you think, or why did the enclosure design and exhibits pique your interest? How did that whole um, interest come about for you?
It's probably the facet of reptile keeping that's always kind of, I guess, piqued my interest the most. I mean, I love everything about keeping reptiles, but I've always been one that likes to design an enclosure and build it. And I mean, I was by no means a handyman. I knew nothing going into zookeeping. Quite literally, everything I knew, I kind of developed the skills as we went along, as so many people do, particularly in working in smaller private facilities. You kind of have to be that hands-on bit of a jack of all trades, and that was certainly the case. So I started dabbling in, firstly, just building a few enclosures, and I mean the enclosure itself, just the box, and then from there, I started to obviously dabble around with the rock work side of things, which is where I've kind of taken it the furthest. That's primarily these days what I spend a lot of time doing and am quite obsessed with. But yeah, setting up an enclosure, naturalistic, seeing the animal utilize it, that is really what has always kind of tick the biggest box for me in terms of keeping an animal in captivity, and it's just always what I've got the most enjoyment out of.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to want to see the animals that you keep do the things that they would do naturally. Um, if you if you are wanting to build a new enclosure for a species that you haven't kept before, how would you go about it? How would you start the design process? What are some factors that you'd consider?
Yeah, so that's, yeah, great question. I have done a bit of that in my time. We've had species come in that I've never kept before, and there's never even really been many in captivity to begin with. So you've kind of got to start at ground zero. And for me, the first thing I'll always do is go back to the natural history. What's this animal doing in the wild? Where's it spending its time? Just research, research, research. Try and find photos of that animal in the wild, or if not, at least try and get a nice depiction of what their habitat's like. Because from there, I think you can base a lot of your decisions on where you might, set things up. Obviously, in a much smaller space, so you need to take that into consideration. If you've got a leaf-tailed gecko that is sitting 15 meters up a fig tree, you're not going to be able to replicate that in an exoterra. So you have to kind of
No.
shrink everything down and think about microclimates and what you need to provide in order for that animal to do what it wants to do. So if I were, setting up a rock background for, say, an arid species, I would think about where my basking site's going to be, where's that animal going to be spending a lot of its time, and then kind of work out the design for the rock work from there. I guess a pretty standard practice is for a rock background to have a pretty large shelf sitting under the basking site, and that way you've got somewhere where the animal can sit out and not only display for the viewer, but also it's got somewhere sturdy to sit when it is basking. It can move away from that spot, but it's always got somewhere kind of focal within the exhibit to keep returning to and basking. And of course, it's not just what the animal's going to be doing. It's also where you're going to be observing this animal, and that particularly becomes important when you're talking about zoo exhibits, because whilst the animals are there to educate and inspire people, they can't do any of that if the people can't see them. So you've got to think about where the animal's going to display and how best to set up the exhibit from that perspective as well.
Yeah, you've got to dance a bit of a line with zoo exhibits in
Mm,
my experience, and it's a line of happy and healthy active animal and healthy and happy and active customers viewing the animal. There's
100%. And
yeah,
yeah, and it also comes down to species selection. Like you're not going to be able to provide what you need to for something like a prickly forest skink to be sitting out proud displaying for visitors. So you're not going to select a species like that to put in a reptile house, or in even within a private collection. If seeing your animals is what you're really interested in, you just have to think about that stuff. And there's a lot of incredible species that are very active, very visible a lot of the day, and I think zoos need to be heading in that direction, because compromising the welfare of the animal just so that the public can see it is not in anyone's interest. So I think that's an important thing to factor in as well.
I concur. I concur, Jake. I also we did something, not that recently, probably about 18 months ago now, is we keep a bit of a number of common tree snakes at work, and they're in back of house enclosures, and we've got like a stack of exoterras, and
Hmm.
it made more sense for us to put the tree snakes at the highest in the highest exoterra, because they're
Hmm.
you would think they're arboreal, they'd want to sit up the top and be able to watch us from a safety or a safe sort of spot, rather than be down around our feet where we're walking past and waving our big hairy legs in front of them each day. I think that's something that is worth considering too for your captive animals, at least in a home setting, or in a private setting, or even a zoo setting, back at house as well, is where is going to be comfortable for the animal in that
Yeah,
enclosure in the room as well.
absolutely. And I think another thing that I find to be really helpful is if I'm starting to build, a bit of escape in an exhibit, whether it's, putting in logs or real rock or fake rock, I'll always try and have the lighting as it's going to be when the animal's in there. If you've just got a random, light in there that you're using while you're building the enclosure, and then you're intending on putting a whole bunch of LEDs and T5s and basking lights in there, you're going to be playing catch up at the end, because you didn't see any of that lighting from the get go and how it reacts with the scape that you're providing. You're going to not see where the shadows are, where your brightest spots are going to be, where your basking sites are going to be. So whilst it might be a bit hot to work in there with a heat light above you, still flick it on every now and again to be able to get a bit of an idea as to how that whole environment is going to look at the end. Because if you can work out all the mistakes and move things around before everything's set in stone, so to speak, which it very much is when you're talking about this mock rock,
Nice.
it's a lot easier.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. So when you are doing your rock work, which we will get to your business rock work at some stage for sure. But when you're doing it and you're setting up an exhibit like to be viewed by the public, are you just taking inspiration from like where those animals would occur naturally, and are you taking into account like aesthetic things like the rule of thirds and all that sort of stuff as well, or are you just sort of freestyling a bit?
Yeah, it's definitely a bit of mix of both. I think when you've been doing it a while, you get a pretty good picture of what is going to look good. And I always try and, as a absolute rule, you always want to try and avoid uniformity. So I think I see a
Yeah.
lot of rock backgrounds where you've got perfectly level, basking shelves and lots of kind of very uniformly shaped rock. But if you look at a rock shelf or a rock escarpment out in nature, there is so much complexity and randomness to a naturally occurring rock. So I think that's a really good place to start. You've got to kind of get out of your head, because we as humans, of course, we like straight lines. We like everything to
Oh
be
yeah.
plumb and uniform, and that's just not what nature is. So I think as a first step, you've kind of got to fight yourself a little bit to make it look like something would in the wild. And I think that's where your reference photos, or just looking at a lot of rocks and scapes in nature, comes into play. And I do a lot of that, and I've seen a lot of reptiles in the wild whilst herping, so I kind of have already a pretty good idea of what's going to look good. And then from there, as you're starting to form up the exhibit, you can move things around and actually look with your eye and see what's going to look good. Like I've started enclosures before and got a third of the way through and then just hated it, and you rip it all out and start again, and that's all just part of the process. And the really great thing about um, I guess artificial rock work is you do have to go through that initial stage of forming it up. So you can kind of get a pretty good idea where your shapes are going to be, where your basking ledges and things like that are going to be before it gets into that very permanent stage. So you can chop and change to a certain point, and then afterwards, of course, you're committed from there. But hopefully, that's kind of when you've got it exactly how you want.
True. Can you explain forming it up?
Yeah, so I guess depending on what you want to achieve will depend on how you form up your rock work. So a lot of what you see in I guess, the private hobbyist community is people either using like polyurethane expanding foam. It's very common. You can get it at any trade store, or you're using styrofoam, or you can get this extruded polystyrene, which is I guess, the more rigid boards that you can also purchase. So a lot of people will use those because it's far less messy than actual polystyrene. I certainly prefer to use those if I'm working in foam. And that's fantastic if you're doing something like an Exoterra or even a small, maybe like 4x4 background or something like that. Typically, you can use foam. You can reinforce it if you want to with some chicken wire, and that's basically going to give you the foundation for what you're then going to be applying your mix onto, whether it's grout or tile adhesive or mortar, whatever you kind of choose to use. But then I guess it goes a bit more advanced if you're talking about something like a zoo exhibit or anything that people are going to be walking on. You want it to be very, very solid, and you'd construct it almost like you would a concrete slab. So a lot of the rock work I do these days, I'm using steel bar and actually bending that into the shapes that I want, and then basically creating almost like a steel cage. So you get that basically very rudimentary shape of the rock, and then from that you can then apply your mesh, which is then what your mortar mix is applied to, and that will give you a very, very solid foundation to basically construct your rocks upon, and it will hold up for many, many, many years if you do it correctly. There's a lot of artificial rock out there that's been around for 70, 80, 100 years. If you do it
Yeah,
well from the get-go, it should last a very, very long time.
gotcha. So after you've made, say you're building a zoo rock wall, and do you paint it? Do you paint on top of it? And if you do, how do you ensure that the paint stays? Like over time, I'm talking about like a lizard's just done a poo on it in the same spot every day for 2 years, and you're there with your little brush, brushing
Mm.
the poo and probably the paint off.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So that's kind of the very final step. So typically, what I like to do is sculpt and carve everything, and then let it completely cure for sometimes up to a week, depending on the weather conditions. It can really take that long for all of that moisture to leave the mix, and you end up with I guess, a bone dry surface that will then take either stains or paints very, very nicely. And when I say stains, a lot of what people use are acid stains. So they're actually pigments which have been mixed with acid, which will actually cause a chemical reaction with the concrete or the mortar, and that's a very permanent, I guess, option. Once it's in there, you cannot get it. You cannot get it out. It literally will seep into the surface and have a chemical reaction. When you apply it, you can hear it fizzing as it makes contact with the surface. So I've done a bit of that, but you can absolutely use paints, and it will still be quite durable. It just depends on what paints you're using. So if you're using paints to paint say, a standard background in an indoor enclosure, you could absolutely get away with using acrylic paints, which are very readily available, quite cheap, and will certainly last for you in most cases. Where acrylics really seem to fail is if you've got somewhere that people are walking all over, or as you said, you're constantly scrubbing it, or you've got somewhere that's exposed to the sun or even a UV lamp for long periods, that will fade those paints right out over time. And so, what I will typically do is utilize some pretty high quality exterior house paint because it's designed to sit outdoors. It's designed to be very durable, last for years on the outside of buildings. And you can use those, you can water them down and then apply them to the rock. And that in and of itself is very, very durable. But if you wanted to go one step further, you can at the end seal everything, and that will create quite a solid surface that may still over time be subject to a bit of discoloration, particularly if you've got people walking over it constantly. That's the main thing that I've found causes damage to paint, because I've done a few like pathways and stairs and things like that. But in most cases, if you're doing rock work for an animal exhibit, that is a more than adequate way to color the rock.
Okay, good to know. I might be bothering you for some tips. I've got a little bit of paint that's coming off in an exhibit, so I might have to get in and try and patch some of that up at some stage. But before we move on from this topic, the business that you're operating now is Crete Habitats. Obviously, pretty passionate about the rock work. So how did the business side of it come about?
Yeah, it was something that I never really thought about doing, to be honest. It was very much a thing I was just doing on the side. I was just doing it to kind of improve my own skill set. And I guess over time, I started doing a bit of it at ARP, and then just started getting asked to do it for a few people. I did a couple of backgrounds for some private keepers, and then slowly but surely, obviously I've got a lot of contacts within the industry. I've been in the zoo industry now for just over 10 years, so I know a lot of people at a lot of different zoos, and I guess the word just kind of got out that I was doing a bit of this, and yeah, slowly but surely I've kind of ticked away at a few different projects at a few different facilities, which has been really exciting for me because, yeah, as I said, it's not something that I ever intended at the start, but there was a bit of a need for it, and I guess I put the time into doing it over and over and over, and getting to a reasonable level where I thought I was able to supply the service to others. And I guess a bit of a difference for me is as well is that I come into it with an animal and specifically a hurt background. So, I'm not a tradie or a construction worker by any means, but I'm simply a reptile keeper that can do a bit of this stuff on the side. So it's been a nice kind of combination that's definitely worked in my favor.
Yeah, cool. How do you fit it in? How do you go about adding jobs in, maybe at different like cities or whatever? How do you fit that into to your life? You've obviously got a little one, and you've got a full-time job as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's been keeping me busy the last few years. Absolutely. I attempt to do as much as I possibly can on site here at home, and that way I can kind of go into it already a few steps ahead. It's a lot easier for me if I can install on site and already be days of work ahead of where I would have been if I started from scratch. So yeah, typically if I'm dealing with a client, either they'll give me the enclosure and then I'll do it here, and that's of course the easiest way to do it. They just pick it up at the end. But if it's something that's of a much larger scale, I can typically do a lot of the forming up, just kind of out of my head and with measurements from them. And then that way, when I do end up on site, it's a much shorter process. Essentially, you're getting straight into the actual mortar, concrete, work, as opposed to having to spend all this time at the start prepping everything. It just speeds up the whole process. So I guess that's the way I've been able to do it. But I have worked a lot of weekends and a lot of late nights, just to kind of fit it in. But it's something that, I love doing. So I don't really see it as too much of a job just yet. It's more of a kind of still very much a passion and a hobby. And yeah, it's something that I love doing. So I've managed to make it work.
Awesome. If you can do something that you love sort of as a hobby and have a little bit of money coming in on the side too, that's a pretty nice thing. Um,
Oh, absolutely.
I and do you just take like commissions or clients pretty willingly? How does that work?
Yeah. So I guess people can reach out to me, and like, I don't want to make this too much of a sales pitch, but if people are interested, yeah, I am doing these backgrounds and even, kind of standalone things. Like, I just did a termite mound for an echidna exhibit, actually, which I was able to do entirely here, at home, and deliver it. So those kinds of smaller things are certainly nice and enjoyable and easy for me to knock out. But if people are serious and want, want some work done, they can always reach out to me. I do always say to people up front, there's a major disadvantage to what I do, and that is the weight of the enclosure at the end of it.
Yeah.
This style of rock work that I do really is designed for zoo enclosures that are permanent. So when you transfer that across to, I guess, a private hobbyist's, standard either melamine or form ply or PVC enclosure, it adds a
A lot of weight.
tremendous amount of weight to the end product. I've done a few backgrounds in PVC enclosures, which, as you know, are light as a feather to begin with. You can quite literally carry them just on your own with relative ease. But once there's a rock background in them, no way. It's a two-person carry at the very least. And I've even done a few enclosures where we're struggling with two of us. So it
Oh,
definitely
jeez.
it definitely comes with its pros and cons. I think it can produce a much more natural looking background to a lot of the foam and grout backgrounds that you typically see, but you're going to add a tremendous amount of weight to that enclosure. So it's all about what people want, at the end of the day.
Were you shit at the start? Or
Of
did you,
course.
or did you just
No,
did you just have a bit of a knack for it from the get-go?
no, it definitely took a little bit to get the hang of. I would probably say that I started out with a bit of an advantage because I was very artsy when I was younger. I used to draw all the time as a kid. I actually even went to art lessons for a very long period of time. I did a bit of clay sculpture back in the day, so I kind of came into it with probably a bit more of a fundamental knowledge than a lot of people would. But in saying that, I'd never mixed a single bit of mortar in my life until I started, just playing around with a few little rocks and a few backgrounds here and there. And yeah, believe me, the first background that I did, I look back on it now and it's horrendous. Like, yeah, it looks like a bit of a just a bit of mud slopped on the wall with a few lines carved in it. There's not really any naturalistic elements to it at all. It quite literally just looks like a bit of mortar slapped on a back wall of an enclosure. So it, like anything, it just comes down to practice, and the more you do it, the better you get at it. And
Yeah,
I mean, thankfully, this day and age as well, there's so much in terms of resources online for literally anything you want to learn. You want to pick up a new skill. 40 years ago, it might have been a bit tricky, but now you can just jump on YouTube and work it out
YouTube.
pretty quickly. So
Yeah.
yeah, there's been a lot of that over the years as well, and a lot of people in person that have been willing to help me out and give me a bit of guidance too.
Yeah, that's handy, especially working down in places like AIP and Symbio, where you are working with guys with stacks of experience that can sort of offer those hands where you need them. Um, in
Yeah,
your
absolutely.
in your time at well, you're still in zoos, but is there any particular species that you've enjoyed working with more than others? Do you have a
Yeah,
favorite?
absolutely. Yeah, if I had to say my two favorite reptiles that I've worked with over the years, or maybe I can extend that out to three, I would probably say Komodos as the number one. I think most people that have worked with Komodos, that's going to be your answer. They are absolutely incredible animals. And then I've had the fortune of working with king cobras as well, which are I think anyone that works with snakes or loves snakes, particularly venomous snakes, that's kind of like the pinnacle of a venomous snake. There's not too much that comes close to working with a 3.5 meter male king cobra. So I would say those two, and then I actually had the chance really toward the end of my time at Reptile Park to work with tuatara, which are a very odd, unique species that very, very few people get to work with. There's less than 10 zoos right around the world that have tuatara, let alone here in Australia. There's currently only two facilities. And at the time, there was none. So I was a big part of the import, which involved bringing three females in from the UK, from Chester Zoo in England. So right from the get-go, I was involved. I did a lot of the paperwork, dealt with CITES, dealt with the government, all the headache that goes along with importing an exotic species, particularly one that hasn't come into the country for, at that point, it was almost 30 years since the last import of tuatara. So there was a lot involved in that. But once we got them and kind of worked out their quirks and their intricacies, they weren't too dissimilar to keeping any other reptile. You just, of course, had to sway things a lot to the cooler side of the spectrum,
Yeah.
because they absolutely are not an animal that likes being above 20 degrees. Ideally, they're
Wow.
sitting at 16, 17 degrees. That's their optimal kind of body temperature. We did still provide basking sites. It was a bit of a lower basking site, kind of sat around 27, 28 degrees, and they would absolutely utilize it. Like in the wild in New Zealand, they'll go out and they'll sit in full sun and bask, but they're not an animal that can deal with high temperatures for any kind of length of time. So, yeah, you really had to make sure that you were providing them with that thermal gradient. Um, it was of utmost importance, probably more so than any other species I've worked with, because they can go downhill so quickly if you're, even the slightest bit out with what they want.
It must have been very gratifying to go through that whole procedure with CITES and with whoever else you needed to, and then to actually get your hands on them. Um, Also, the challenge of keeping them cool. How did you manage that? Because it's obviously not cool all the time down there. So, like down there, I mean Sydney or New South Wales, anyway.
Yeah, no, we get some pretty brutal summer days. Like we just this last Saturday gone, it was 42 degrees Celsius here. So we definitely get some warm weather, and yeah, maintaining a species like that, even in an air conditioned room, would have been pretty tricky. So we actually had to keep them in a big walk in cool room, that was all cool room panel, thermostatically controlled. It was quite literally like a big walk in fridge, and we just were able to set the ambient to what we wanted, which was around that 16, 17 degree mark, and we literally had their entire setup, yeah, within that cool room, so we could, with 100% accuracy, more or less, control that ambient. Because yeah, there was no way we were going to allow for any kind of fluctuation, even on some very warm summer days. So that was the way we got around it. And since then, all those tuatara have gone on exhibits both at ARP and Taronga, and it's exactly the same. Just the exhibits themselves are the cool rooms, so they're cooled right down with some pretty advanced refrigeration systems.
Yeah, we had Michael McFadden on the podcast a few episodes ago, and he talked us through all the heating and cooling and humidity control that they have at Taronga. But I was kind of envisioning when you were saying like cool room panels, literally like someone's just backed up one of those cold room on the back of a trailer into the reptile park, and you're like, yeah, just going to check on the tuataras. You open up the back door, step in, there's a lizard and some dirt in there.
Yeah, it honestly wasn't too dissimilar to that. Probably very similar size to one of those, mobile trailer type cool rooms. We just had to have it constructed within an approved quarantine facility. So,
Oh, of course, yeah.
everything was closely monitored. Like literally any water that came out of the exhibits, it all had to be treated before it could go to waste. Everything had to be, basically taken by a specific quarantine waste disposal company. So, and once you start adding all of these things into the equation, the dollars start to add up. But of course, it was every cent was worth it to get those animals into the country and kind of have them back for people to be able to go and see, because most people are never going to go to one of the offshore islands on, the North Island in New Zealand and see a tuatara in the wild. So for people to be able to see these, what are quite literally a very prehistoric, primitive species in person, it's a pretty incredible thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I had something I was going to say, but I've forgotten it already. What were you feeding them?
So they're strictly carnivorous, so they are primarily insectivores in the wild. So they're eating a lot of like big beetles and grasshoppers, and we were basically providing them with kind of everything that you would give a standard, monitor or a gamet, woodies and earthworms and crickets and beetles. But on top of that, once they get a bit of size about them, they can take a pretty sizable, protein hit as well. And they've absolutely been documented in the wild feeding on nesting shorebirds. So the big
Damn.
boys will consume a pretty sizable meal. And although the tuatara that we had were only 5-year-old females, they were absolutely capable of eating a small rodent here and there. Of course, they're pretty susceptible to obesity. So if you're feeding them a really high calorie diet like that all the time, you'd end up with a very overweight tuatara. So we were primarily feeding the insects, and then every now and again, we'd give them a rodent very sparingly. But it's absolutely part of their wild diet to feed on things like rodents. If they could catch them, probably unlikely, but absolutely they'll take those birds in the middle of the night off their nest. And there's some really great photos online of big males eating the species of bird they primarily feed on is fairy prion. It's a nesting bird that nests on these same islands in New Zealand in enormous numbers in the same habitat as tuatara occur in. So when those birds are nesting at that certain time of year, there's a massive smorgasbord for the big tuatara to be feeding on at night.
That's cool. That's very cool. I'm going to New Zealand actually in a couple of months. I'm unfortunately going to the South Island, but maybe I can track down a zoo or something there that I can see them. If not, I'll just have to
Yeah.
stop into Sydney on the way home. Um, but
There's a big sanctuary on the mainland on the South Island, where you can see. I guess at some point they were reintroduced, but they are living as wild tuatara, and they're pretty common there. So you should absolutely be able to see one while you're over
cool.
there, not in a zoo per se.
Yeah, cool. That's awesome. I didn't know that, so I'll jot that down and look into it. And I imagine you said they're pretty prone to obesity, being a colder species, probably fairly inactive, slow metabolism. So you wouldn't be feeding them very frequently.
No, no. Everything about them is slowed down. Like they live an incredibly long time. There's been records of adults reaching 150 plus years. So they live a very, very long time, and they take a long time to mature as well, sexually mature. So yeah, everything is slowed right down. Their metabolism is slow. Of course, when you're sitting at 16, 17 degrees, a lot of the time, you're not overly active. So we would see them primarily if we went in before the lights came on. They're very much pretty nocturnal, and then very early in the morning they'd come out and bask. But after that, they were down in their little makeshift burrows that we had made for them, and you'd see a head or maybe a head and a couple of forelimbs. But during the day, you very rarely saw much more than that, and they would almost immediately retreat if you open the door of that cool room in the middle of the
Yeah.
day.
I feel like that's the quintessential tuatara, is just sitting out of
Yep,
their little
head out of the
den or
burrow.
hide head and forelimbs. Um, have you been to New Zealand? Done any herping there?
I have, yeah, very, very brief trip. Actually, just last year, I went over for the Chelonian workshop that the AZK put on at Auckland Zoo, which was an amazing few days, a very nerdy few days talking about turtle and tortoise husbandry and reptile lighting and heating. Frances Baines was the keynote speaker there, so she did several amazing talks on UV and basically how to utilize that in captive reptiles. But we did actually get out on one of the nights, and I wanted to desperately see Anultinus, which is a genus of gecko in New Zealand, which are absolutely unlike anything we have in Australia. Most of the members of that genus are bright green. And the one we actually got to see because we were based out of Auckland for the trip was the Auckland green gecko. So we got to see a couple of those in a site not too far out of the city. I won't obviously disclose any locations because they are probably one of the most heavily poached lizards on the face of the earth because of their beauty. But yeah, that was amazing. I've wanted to see one of those for such a long time. I'm probably more obsessed with geckos and seeing geckos in the wild than any other group of Australian reptile. So to be able to see what are a very closely related group of geckos, but again so unique, was definitely a bit of a bucket list thing for me.
Yeah, that's awesome. I was hoping to maybe incorporate a bit of that into my trip in March. So maybe if I get lucky and I'm in the right spots at the right time, I might stumble upon one of those stunning. They're crazy. They're the most bright green geckos. Like,
Yeah,
they're
yeah,
crazy.
they very much remind me of a few species of Stropurus. Like if you look at Stropurus michaelsoni on the west coast, um, or even like a big elder eye, they have a very similar body structure, but yeah, just these really long, thin fingers, and yeah, the color is completely unique. We don't have a single gecko in Australia that even comes close to them in terms of appearance, in terms of color. So yeah, they were definitely high on the list.
Understandably so. And what about Australian geckos? You've obviously seen a few of those in your time.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of them. I for a fairly long time was focusing on seeing all the carphodactylids. So that's your knob-tailed geckos and your leaf-tailed geckos. And there's a few obscurities in there, like your viticolus, your granite thick-tailed gecko, plus a few other random species. And thankfully, by this point, I've seen the bulk of those that I kind of can see. There's a few particular Philurus that are in some very, very hard places to get to, and then also the Saltuarius. I've only got one of those left to see, the big leaf tail that's up on a very remote mountaintop just north of Cairns there, Saltuarius eximius, which to
Yep.
the best of my knowledge you pretty much need a helicopter to access. So I think that's
Yep.
pretty much out of
Might be
reach
out.
or
Yeah.
off limits
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
for most people. So I don't know. I'm that may be one that I never see, but if I can see the ones that I can get to, that's kind of been my goal for a while. But now I'd really like to get back over to WA and particularly in the north to see a few of the Adura that I've still got left to see. I did the Kimberley a few years ago and saw Adura felicipoda, which are an amazing lizard. And then I also got Gracilis, but I didn't get to Murumanu, which are a little bit further south, kind of in the central Kimberley, a limestone specialist. So at the moment, they're probably top of the list for geckos in this country that I'd like to see, or at least that are accessible.
Are you planning to go back to the Kimberley and track a few of those down?
Oh, definitely, yeah. Always got plans to get back to Northern Australia and back to WA. They're some of my favorite places. The Kimberley is it's a hard place to get to, and I mean traveling domestically at the moment is it's expensive too. Like it's honestly cheaper
Oh,
to go overseas and as an Australian than it is to fly to the other side of the country. So I'll definitely get back up there at some stage and see those. And there's a myriad of other species that I would like to see as well. I'm pretty far into seeing all of the Strophaurus, but there's a few pretty range restricted ones that I still need to tick off. So yeah, like anyone, I'm a bit of an obsessive lister, and I like to kind of see entire genuses when I can. So yeah, there's a few key Australian gecko um, genera that I'm pretty close, and yeah, Strophaurus and Odura are two of the big ones. Yeah.
there's a lot of reptile keepers that like to have things in a certain order, and they have a particular special interest, and there's
Yeah,
there's
there's
a
a
lot
lot.
of, there's
There's a
a
lot of us that are on the spectrum to some
yeah,
degree.
there's a spectrum. We're all on it. We're
Yeah,
all on
that's
there.
it.
It's just how far along is the question. Um,
100%.
well, I did have more questions, but you pretty much just answered them all throughout the course of this. It's been great.
Oh, awesome. Thanks, mate. Well, yeah, I'm sure there's a lot more we could chat about, but yeah, thanks for having me on and yeah, I really love what you're doing with the podcast as well. I've thoroughly enjoyed it so far. So yeah, great to now be a part of it, and yeah, hopefully we can get on another time at some point for more of a chat.
Yeah, that'd be good. I'll have to do some more research on geckos and and whatnot to drag another one out. But you happy? You happy? Anything else you wanted to cover, or you're okay?
No, I think that's pretty much it. I mean, I'm a pretty obsessive photographer as well. I've got photos of most things that I've seen out in the out in the Australian bush. So if people are interested in seeing photos of some of these, I guess in some cases pretty rare and obscure um, herps, yeah, you can just jump onto my Instagram. Most of what I post is on there, or I do also have a Flickr account. So yeah, if people are interested in seeing a few cool Australian reptiles, there's not much captive stuff on there. I've tried to keep it mostly wild reptiles, but there is a few bits and pieces of species that I've worked with in the years as well. But yeah, that's kind of where people can reach out to me as well, either about herps in general or mock rock. And as you said earlier, if people do want to look at what I'm doing with the rock work side of things, I do have an Instagram set up for Crete Habitats as well. But the link for that is on my standard Instagram, just Jake Meney.
Yeah, very cool. I'll obviously put those links in the description for this as well. Well, Thanks, Jake. That was really great. I enjoyed it.
Thanks, mate. Appreciate it. Have a good
No
one.
worries. You too. As always, everyone, thanks so much for listening. Feel free to reach out to me on Instagram at joemac.uthl. If you've enjoyed the content, please consider liking, subscribing, and following along. Cheers.